Dave, Chris crashed on his recce about 2 hours ago now, but we don't know much more. What can you tell us?
Yeah, he's had a bad crash actually. He's hit a wall at 60 km an hour, something like that. He's got a bad fracture. He's badly injured. It sounds like he's got a fracture of femur. I mean, clearly he's not going to run at all. I think that's pretty clear.
With the four-time champion Chris Froome now out, who is the new favorite this year at the Tour de France? That is today here on In the Saddle. Steve Schlanger alongside Bob Roll. Bob, the entire complexion of the season's biggest race has changed with Chris Froome crashing out, cannot try and win his 5th Tour de France title. So because of that, who in your mind is the favorite headed towards July?
Well, I always believe there were co-favorites for this year's Tour de France, regardless of how well Chris Froome seemed to be racing leading into the Tour and crashing before the time trial in the Dauphiné with significant injuries. And by the way, speediest of recoveries to Chris Froome. Hopefully he gets back on the bike as soon as possible and doesn't have any lasting trauma from a really horrific crash. But I always thought that he and Geraint Thomas had about the same chance to win the Tour, depending on who was riding the best. Both on the same team, which complicates matters, but without Froome, for me, the answer is obvious, that Geraint Thomas is the #1 favorite going into this year's Tour de France.
But again, underscoring the depth of Team Ineos, you also have a young rider like Egan Bernal, who could also potentially be very good. So as far as a game plan, does Dave Brailsford say, okay, with Froome out, Geraint Thomas is my undisputed #1 leader, or does he continue the co-leader theme and make Bernal a co-leader with Thomas?
It's been crazy for Ineos. Since they changed the team name from Sky to Ineos, Egan Bernal, their designated leader for the Giro, crashed before that, couldn't start. Presumably he will be recovered by the Tour de France in order to do a start. But I don't think that Egan this year will have the race miles and the intensity to be in contention at the end of 3 weeks at the Tour de France. So if I'm Dave Brailsford, I put all the pressure on last year's winner, by the way, the defending champion, Geraint Thomas. And I make sure that Egan is strong enough, which they haven't announced the final roster yet. You've got to assume that Egan is going to be on the team and is strong enough to be a solid helper for Geraint Thomas. But to expect him to be better than that is maybe a little unrealistic, especially he's a very young professional. He's only been pro for a couple of years, right, and he's still developing physically. If I'm Dave Brailsford, I do not put that pressure on Egan Bernal, that you're going to be co-leaders in the Tour de France with last year's winner. No way.
Well, they were going to make him the leader at the Giro d'Italia, so obviously they have a lot of faith in him. And
Absolutely.
He's shown that he can not only be a great climber, he can ride at the front during echelons. He's strong in that regard. He's not bad against the clock, so why not throw him out there as a potential leader?
I would, plan D+ for Egan Bernal. No plan B at this point. No plan C either. But if something happens to Geraint Thomas, I think even if that were to be a hypothetical that let's hope that does not happen, yeah, I still wouldn't at this point put Egan Bernal under that much pressure, that much media scrutiny in the biggest race of the year, the Tour de France. For a young athlete, that will not pay, and historically, correct me if I'm wrong, not pay the dividends you want from a big investment in a young athlete like Egan Bernal.
But as a co-leader, you're taking some of the pressure off him. You're still saying, okay, Geraint Thomas is the veteran, he's the defending champion, and you sort of ease the burden of Bernal by still giving him the chance at the same time to do well, and maybe by default, if something happens to Thomas, be ready to take the lead.
Yeah, that's fine. That's no problem. I mean, he's going to sit on anyways the first couple of weeks until the big mountains in the final week in the Alps, the last few massive stages. So physically, the rigors that he can expect to go through are different than his teammates on Team Ineos, who have to do the long, pulverizing miles throughout the opening 2 weeks. That won't change. Egan Bernal will not be doing those miles unless it's absolutely a panic situation, an emergency situation when the rivals are up the road and he's the last man standing. But that is different than being a team leader. You're sitting on and benefiting from the work of your teammates, but you don't have any pressure to perform. Your job should be, and it would be surprising to me if it wasn't, to do whatever Geraint Thomas needs to do to be safe and competitive throughout the 3 weeks.
The thing about, though, Bernal last year's top 15, wasn't a protected rider, had really no expectations of anything, and still the work he had to do, he still had a very solid result. So if you gave him more responsibility without the true pressure of being a singular leader, man, I mean, why waste a year?
Well, last year was a lot different situation. He had just won Tour of California. He wasn't coming back from an injury. So I think he was probably better prepared last year also, physically, than he will be this year. That remains to be seen. But going into it, theoretically, from a team standpoint, losing Chris Froome, putting all the pressure on Geraint Thomas, who has had that before and delivered, would be a much better plan than to try to fast forward Egan Bernal. We've seen that a few times in the past, when there's plan A and a hypothetical plan B. Plan A falls apart, they fast track plan B, and it goes pitifully wrong. And it has happened to that team before. Chris Froome was the big leader of Team Sky in the 2014 Tour. Richie Porte was plan B, plan C minus, there to help Chris Froome. Chris Froome was crashed out, broken wrist early in the race, in the first week of the race. They fast-tracked Richie to team leader, all the pressure. He's been riding very well, but that's a very different job description. And Richie, I'm not sure if he's recovered from that pressure yet. Didn't work out then, and I don't think it would work out again.
Now, I can tell you're obviously sold on Geraint Thomas as being the sole leader. Do you have any level of concern if you look at his build-up for this year's Tour compared to last year? Coming into last year's Tour, he was winning everything. Every race he entered, he was in the yellow jersey, top step of the podium. Okay, this year, not only hasn't won anything, but admittedly, he hasn't been training with the same, let's say, effervescence as he did before. He said prior to his final prep race, the Tour de Suisse, he was still a pound or two shy of his ideal racing weight. So, I mean, are you a little nervous about your boy?
If you have not won the Tour, you need to reassure yourself and your teammates you're capable of doing that by being as successful as possible. And Chris Froome followed a similar trajectory. Before he had won the Tour, he was very focused on huge results leading up to the Tour to give his team confidence to do all the work necessary. Once he did that, he could throttle back a little bit and be 100% ready just for the Tour and nothing else. Geraint's riding better, pretty solid in the Tour of Romandy recently, on the podium, didn't win. Primož Roglič, who was on fire, dominated Romandy. And maybe Roglič is a good example, a little bit too fit and fell apart at the end of the 3 weeks of the Giro d'Italia, which was his main objective of the year. So I think Geraint Thomas is on a perfect trajectory physically to defend his title. The only person he would have really had to race if he was on a different team, hypothetically, would have been Chris Froome. So because of the team dynamics, super complicated on Team Ineos and for Geraint Thomas. And so I think he was preparing himself with the idea to be his best in July at the Tour and the Tour only, and not worry about anything else.
Not to get too esoteric on you, even though if there's anybody I could get esoteric with, I know it's you, Bob. But the final point with regard to Team Ineos. Last year, both Geraint Thomas and the team collectively knew they had the safety net in Chris Froome. All right.
And they would have lost.
And now, well, that could have been different. But things changed this year, all right? Thomas has to assume the pressure. The team has to ride for Geraint Thomas under this scenario. So does that change psychologically for this team that's always known that they were riding for Froome at the Tour?
No, I mean, they told Geraint he was going for the Tour and Chris was going for the Giro in January. So Geraint knew throughout the year he was going to have that pressure throughout the year and all the way through the Tour de France. That changed a little bit after Chris started feeling better and better in the Tour de France after winning the Giro. So Geraint preparing himself emotionally, physically to be the leader of Team Ineos is not something he hasn't done before. And when he was allowed to do that, he delivered with the win. Don't forget that. In spite of everything that he was stacked up against, including his own teammate. So to have that wherewithal, that ambition, and that rage, that anger that he must have been feeling in the last few days of the Tour de France, that's not going to go away, no matter who the leader is.
All right. Bob, I think that you're not wrong all right? I will say, first of all, from my perspective, you got to give Egan Bernal more of a leadership role. I think you got to give him more leash, more of an opportunity, because I think he could be good and he could be a solid option.
Why would you do that?
Because he's proven that he can ride in different conditions, that he's a strong rider. I don't care about how young he is. One of the things that I don't like is in cycling, in so many instances, and not just at the Tour de France, but in other races as well, they say, oh, you know, he's got no pressure. He's got no pressure. He could just go out and be free, enjoy his racing. Put some pressure on. Who cares? You're getting paid. You're a professional cyclist, all right?
It's a good way to burn out.
You're making a good living, all right? You're supposed to have pressure. This isn't a Cat 3 race.
How's it working out for TJ Van Garderen, for example? A lot of pressure as young.
Everybody's different,
right.
Okay? Everybody's different. And you know what? If you can't hack it, you don't make it. If you can't hack it, you get weeded out.
That's a very good point. Everybody's different. And the best team managers understand the characteristics and what they're capable of. And so if the sort of, and what we hear following the event is not necessarily what goes on behind closed doors and how the riders are treated with the team management.
Right.
What we get is little sound bites, and we sort of have to extrapolate how they must be thinking about their star riders. And if they say not putting any pressure on him, it's probably for a pretty good reason. You know, they might be a little bit more high-strung and take longer to develop. Bradley Wiggins didn't win his first Grand Tour until he was deep into his career. Same with Chris Froome. If he had huge pressure when he turned pro in 2007, dude, you're on Barlow World, you have to win the Tour de France. He would have had a very different career. To put these young riders in that situation, I think is a bad idea. Physically, it takes longer. You're talking about a 3-week athletic contest.
I get what you're saying. I just say, you know, enough of the kids' gloves. You know, let's just treat them like men, like pros. But anyway, you know,
I'm glad you're not my team manager.
I do agree. Geraint is probably the favorite. I like Egan Bernal, though. I think that if he ends up in the yellow jersey in the Champs-Elysees, don't be surprised. All right.
I'll mark your words. Well, I'm going to write that down. Egan.
That's not what you're writing, but I
get it. Bernal.
All right.
Yellow. In Paris, and I will buy you a beer if that happens. I will owe you a beer.
Well, somebody stop buying Geraint Thomas the beers now, because that's his only problem in leading up to this Tour de France. Too many pints of Guinness, so we'll see if he's laid off and if he's ready to go.
Come on, man.
Come July. All right, so Bob Roll definitively in on the Geraint train to defend his Tour de France yellow jersey from last year. What do you think? Add the comments below here on In the Saddle.